So here's your class example. This is what you should have picked up in your reading time. You are currently engaged on the audit of Checkers Limited, a new audit client. So I should be saying pre-engagement, and I should be saying risk at the financial statement level because of opening balances. You have been tasked with auditing the trade debtors balance at 31 March 2021. So I can see it's now trade debtors. You have performed the following audit work to date. So this has been done. Compare the list of debtors in the current period to the list of debtors in the prior period to identify missing debtors. So they have done a test for completeness. Inspected the bank confirmation and loan agreements for cession of debtors. So they've done some tests for rights. Inspected the minutes of directors' meetings during the current period to determine whether the board of directors have used their debtors' balance as security for any loans. Another procedure for rights. Sent debtors' confirmations to a sample of debtors at 31 March 2021 to confirm their balance, all of which have replied confirming the balance noted on the confirmation. So they've done existence, and what it shows me is that what they are showing in their financials matches to their customers. So that's a very good indication that their debtors may be valued correctly. Performed subsequent receipts testing for a sample of debtors' balance at 31 March 2021. So subsequent receipts is for existence, so proving that the debtors that they have raised do actually exist. And obtained a management representation letter for the debtor balance on 31 March 2021. So this could be for all your assertions, and there's a nice general procedure that's been done. Required. Design the additional substantive procedures that you will conduct to verify that trade debtors are fairly presented at 31 March 2021. So I need to consider what substantive procedures are missing from the substantive procedures that I would want to do for trade debtors, and I need to list them. So I can now go up here. For 20 marks, guys, so let's just finish this assessment. I would then, as my starting point, assess this required and say, first of all, what do I know about substantive procedures? I know that there are general procedures, there are analytical procedures, which is part of my general, but I always just put it down to remind myself, and then there are tests of detail. What is the balance that I'm looking at? Trade debtors. So in terms of my test of detail, I need to have audit work for existence, completeness, rights, valuation, presentation and disclosure, because it's a balance. And then I say, what is trade receivables? Well, trade receivables, according to IFRS, should be recorded at the recoverable amount, which is ultimately going to be the gross amount less an allowance credit losses. So now I already know, we've got an allowance, which means there's an estimate here. And so I know I've got lots of procedures for the estimate, and then there's a gross amount, so I'll have to look at that too. Okay, so guys, I've assessed what I need to be doing. I then come back into what's been done so that I can go and see or tick off what has already been done. They've got one procedure for completeness. So I'm going to say there's one there, maybe I've got additional I can do. For rights, they've gone and tested for cession in bank confirmations, loan agreements, minutes of directors' meetings. So I'm actually going to cross off rights because I'm comfortable that they've done sufficient procedures for rights. Existence. I've now got debtors' confirmations and subsequent receipt testing. So from a debtor's perspective, I feel like they've done sufficient for existence. So I'm going to cross off existence. And then I've got one procedure as a general procedure. So I know then that I'm going to have marks for getting more of my general procedures done, marks for doing analyticals because they haven't done anything, marks for maybe doing some more for completeness if I can think of anything else. Valuation is going to be huge because they've done nothing for valuation. And I know from a valuation perspective, I'm going to have to test the gross amount and the estimate. And then presentation and disclosure. So guys, now that 20 marks, I can go and say, okay, well maybe I'm going to get an additional 6 for general procedures. I'm maybe going to get an additional 3 for analytical procedures. For valuation, the gross amount, doing a recon and checking that recon, I could get about 2. And then for the allowance, I could get about 8. Presentation and disclosure, 1. So now, all of a sudden, I'm not so nervous. Okay, guys, I say valuation 8 for the estimate, but that's only 8 standard procedures. There's components to that I'm going to have to test, so there will be more. All right, so how do you start? We start with our general procedures. And I can go and do my opening and closing balances. So, agree the opening balance in the current year financial statements to the closing balance in the prior financial statements. And for my closing, agree closing balance in the trade receivables ledger to the GL, TB, and financial statements. Guys, you will either write those out or have a legend showing GL, general ledger, TB, trial balance, FS, financial statements. Then, because I have got a ledger that's made up of lots of transactions, I'm going to go and cast the trade receivables ledger, and then I'm going to scan through the ledger for unusual items. And here I could say things like credits, because it should be debtors. I'm now going to consider the effectiveness of controls and the impact on the substantive procedures. And then I'm going to get into my analytical procedures. So for debtors, I can say, compare the following for reasonableness. So I'm explaining why I'm doing this comparison. Prior year debtors to the current year debtors. I can say compare the prior year allowance for credit losses to the current year allowance. I can compare credit sales as a percentage of debtors in the current year to the prior year to see if it makes sense. So I put down 3 or so analytical procedures. And now I go into my test of detail. My focus here is going to be the valuation assertion. And I need to do the gross amount and the allowance. So for the gross amount, I'm going to do that reconciliation. I'm going to agree the debtors list or ledger to the general ledger. And I'm going to follow up on reconciling items. Then, because the list is made up of multiple debtors, I can go and do further recons, where I can go select a sample of individual debtors on the list or ledger and go and compare it to the debtor statement. So I can make sure that those two match. And I can test the actual cost of the debtor for a sample of debtors by tracing it to the invoice. So select a sample of transactions in a debtor's balance and trace it to an invoice to make sure that it is recorded at the correct amount. Now I want to get into that allowance for credit losses. So I've got to first test the policy, find out, inquire what the policy is. Then I need to test if it's consistent and reasonable. So compare the policy to the prior year to see if it's consistent. And then compare it to the market to see if it's reasonable. Then I need to look at the components of the calculation, guys, and this is going to be based on the aging of the debtor. So I can go and test the aging of debtors. How do I do that? I'm going to select a sample of debtors' balances in the different aging categories and trace it to the invoice to look at the date to ensure that it's been aged correctly. I can then go and recalculate the allowance. I'm not going to go reconsider the controls over the allowance because we already did that as a general procedure. I'm not going to get an expert, guys, because you can only get an expert where there is a complexity in the estimate. And this is an accounting estimate which doesn't have any other complexity, so I shouldn't need an expert. I can now go and get subsequent information though. So I can go and inspect receipts post year end to see if any have settled and therefore whether the allowance is actually reasonable. Another way I can test whether the allowance is reasonable is by comparing the bad debts in the current year to the allowance in the prior year. So I can just see if the way of determining the allowance is reasonable. I can then go and develop my own point estimate. I don't want to go too much further down, guys, because that is the actual solution. I'm just going to put here, do my own auditor's point estimate and compare to the client's estimate to see if it's reasonable. Then I've got presentation and disclosure, so I can simply go and inspect that it has been correctly presented and disclosed in the financial statements. Okay, so I've gone and done general procedures, analytical procedures, presentation disclosure, valuation. What else can you do for completeness? They've gotten a confirmation. They have done the comparison. I'm not too fussed about that. I go back to my question to make sure I've addressed everything, and then, I might pick up opening balances is a risk. A new client. So there could be misstatements in the opening balance. Guys, if you look here, we've done a general procedure where we've agreed it to the prior year closing. But because this is a new client, initial audit engagement, opening balance, maybe I want to go and do some of these procedures that I've done here with the opening balance. So maybe I want to go and do a debtor's confirmation for opening balances to prove that that opening balance was correct. And remember, the standard says if you don't get results from that, then you do subsequent receipts. So maybe I'm going to add here subs receipts for the opening balance. Okay, let's have a look at the solution. So the solution first addresses the general procedures. You've got your effectiveness, opening, closing, casting, scanning, looking for unusual items, and then your analytical procedures. Okay, they did some ratios there. Then opening balance, because it was a new. So this is the only reason why we're doing additional for opening balance during a confirmation or subsequent receipt testing, because that comes from ISA 510. Closing, your gross amount you need to test, and then you can do some individual debtors reconciliations. Then the valuation, the allowance for credit losses, get the policy, see if it's consistent, see if it's reasonable. Compare the bad debts in prior year to the allowance in the current year to see if that was reasonable. So another way for testing reasonability. Looking to see if it was authorized. And then testing the aging. Recalculating. Then another analytical procedure for that. Okay, so lots of marks available, but there was that sneaky additional work because of the opening balances. Okay, looking at the standard we've just addressed. Guys, if it were a question and this was out of 15, I wouldn't have done any additional work for the opening balance, and there probably wouldn't even be marks in the solution for that. Just simply agreeing to the prior, your financials would be sufficient. Okay, so it's only when you get to a point where you realize, I might be struggling to get enough marks, that then you would need to go, okay, maybe I need to do additional work for opening balances. Don't start there, because it's not always going to get you marks. Okay. Questions you guys can expect. Formulate substantive procedures for class of transaction, a transaction, account balance, a journal entry. And guys, a journal entry is going to be very similar to an individual transaction. It's just one entry. But what do you know about a journal entry? There's going to be the date, the description, and the amount. So I know I'm going to have to test the date, cutoff, description for classification, and the amount, valuation or accuracy, and go into the detail about testing those. So I still need to use my assertions. And that's why I say you could be asked to link the substantive procedures to assertions, but you should be comfortable doing that, because you should understand the assertions, understand the risks. And why are you doing substantive procedures? To address the risks. Okay, guys, we will carry on with a little bit more substantive procedure next week, just making sure that you're comfortable with, once again, the cycles and the different balances and transactions that you could be tested on, so that you are able to develop the procedures necessary. Super, guys.